We are ready. So we will start this seminar session. Today it's a pleasure to have with us Redouan Bshary from Neuchâtel University. We know each other for quite some time. When I first met Redouan, I think we were still in Max Planck doing the PhD in civism. Then he moved for a postdoc in Cambridge with Rufus Johnston. Then he reminded me that he had a one-year lecturer position in Liverpool before moving for this permanent position in Neuchâtel, where he has been ever since. Currently Dean of the School of Biological Sciences.
Faculty of Sciences. Yeah.
Faculty of Sciences. So you have also other things apart from biology. Redouan has developed a very impressive body of work on the biology of cooperative behavior, focused mostly on mutualistic interactions between cleanarasses and their client reef fish, but also in the monkeys of West Africa, in what's the name of the forest?
Ivory Coast, Thai National Park.
Thai National Park, monkeys again, doing similar things. So basically the expertise of domains in cognition, cognitive abilities, and their relevance for cooperative behaviors and their evolution. And part of the work of Redouan that I appreciate the most is this ability of crossing species from fish to monkeys and even to humans more recently, and how to make work all these cognitive paradigms so that you can do cross-species comparisons across such different places in vertebrates. So without any further ado, thank you for coming, and looking forward for the talk.
Thanks very much, Troy, and hello everyone. It will be largely an overview talk on putting biology into cooperation theory, so I will present quite a lot of concepts, and at the end I will talk more about my own research. And there are plenty of stories and pictures, so I hope there's something you will keep in mind. It's financed by the Science Foundation, and I have plenty of collaborators, and the names I will give later on during the talk when they are important. So I will give you a brief introduction, and then I have three main points to make. What do payoff matrices actually mean when you typically analyze cooperation with games? Then I will talk about small worlds versus large worlds, which I need to explain. And then after all the conceptual sides, I will explain why we need to be more explicit about mechanisms, and that's where my own research comes in, the more recent one. It's a talk about cooperation, and if you talk about cooperation, you have to accept that terminology is a complete mess. So I just give you the key terms, how I use them, and don't expect that everybody uses it like me. So helping, that's what I'm interested in. Increasing the direct fitness, the reproductive output of a recipient. Altruism, it's about lifetime consequences, negative for the altruist, positive for the recipient. Cooperation, that's beneficial for both, for lifetime reproductive success, and this is within species. Unfortunately, the ecologists 150 years ago, they decided that mutualism is plus between species, so when I talk about mutualism, it's cooperation between species. So just keep this in mind, and keep in mind that other people use these terms differently. Now, when you read cooperation papers, then you always read about the puzzle of cooperation, that it's an evolutionary puzzle. Why should there be cooperation? What is puzzling about cooperation? Well, I have here 20 euros, and I give it to someone. And believe me, it's gone. I will not ask it back. This is gone. And this looks pretty stupid, no? I mean, why would I do this? Well, you can think maybe there's kin selection. Maybe we are related. I don't think we are related. So this is not the standard explanation in evolutionary biology for helping is that you're related. Doesn't apply. So it seems like I lost something now. And this is, when you think about evolutionary theory and egoism, it doesn't make much sense. And this is actually the best way to describe this, the best way to formalize it, is with the so-called prisoner's dilemma game, where you have two players, player one, player two. They have two options. They can invest or defect. You can look at this as euros that you get. And the interesting thing about the game is that mutual cooperation, mutual investment, is better than mutual defection. You both get 3 instead of 1. But if you look in more detail, independently of what your partner is doing, you are better off to defect. If your partner invests and you defect, you get 5 instead of 3. If your partner defects, you get 1 instead of 0. And that means if you cooperate, very often means you have a lower payoff now, less than if you defected. And obviously this loss needs to be compensated in the future, otherwise it would be under negative selection. But when you think about the future, this immediately raises the problem of cheating. So how can you make sure that your partner gives it back to you in the future, or somebody else compensates for this? And this means if you have this kind of game, you need repeated interactions, and then you need some reciprocity in there. I help you as long as you help me. If you don't help me, I don't help you anymore. So these are the kind of ideas, and the prisoner's dilemma has really been the model of studying cooperation in biology. But then, I'm afraid it's about 35 years ago, I was a student, I had lectures, and this is Peter Hammerstein. He's a game theoretician. He gave lectures at the university where I was studying. He introduced the prisoner's dilemma to us, and he said the following thing: the iterated prisoner's dilemma is a great model to introduce potential problems regarding stable cooperation, but it's a bad model to explain actual cooperation in nature. And 35 years later, I still think this is the wisest thing I have heard about the prisoner's dilemma game. So it is not good to explain what is out there in nature. Well, fortunately, we have so many solutions to the problem of why we should see helping in nature. I don't go through this. You just see there are many game theoretic solutions to why helping should be under positive selection. I just give you a very simple example from our own research. The simplest form is that you produce byproduct benefits. You do something that's good for yourself, and it helps your partner as a byproduct. And here you see a grouper and a moray eel. So if you're in a reef, snorkeling or diving, you follow groupers, you see there's a moray eel sticking its head out of a crevice, and now what you will see is that the grouper goes there and shakes its head. It signals, shakes the head again. First time I saw it, I thought maybe that's aggression who is dominant in the reef. There was predators, but that's actually not the case. If the moray eel is hungry, what you see next is they swim off together, best mates. And what makes this association really a successful one is that they are complementary in their hunting strategies. A grouper hunts with speed. So if you're a little fish, you hide in crevices, and that's how you save from a grouper. A moray eel is a slow swimmer. It sneaks through crevices and tries to corner prey inside a crevice. So the best thing you can do if you're a little fish, you go outside. And now you have the problem, if you have a grouper and a moray eel coordinating their actions in space and time, it's neither safe outside nor inside, and that's how they both increase their hunting success, but crucially without trying to increase the success of the partner. As soon as one of them got a fish, it's over for now, and see you next week, because they are fish, they don't need to eat very much. So a very simple explanation, just self-serving benefits. And so cooperation, if you read any paper that says cooperation is an evolutionary puzzle, don't believe it. We have plenty of answers to this. Still, you would like to try to classify these different concepts, and there have been quite a few attempts to do so. There's Lehman and Keller that think more in lifetime fitness consequences. West et al. Try to split up a little bit the reciprocity side. There's a recent book by Michael Taborski and colleagues where they classify it. I also contributed at some point to do some classification of these different concepts. if you're interested, just Google it and read them. What I want to point out to you is it's a useful exercise, but it's a classification of games, and it's not a classification of real biological examples. So you have games and control mechanisms. Do you punish? Do you switch? Do you reciprocate in cooperation? But as a biologist, you want to understand the real cases. And the real cases, you need to first understand the biology before you can classify your examples. And this brings me to my 3 points that I want to make today. So the first one is actually, what do these pair of matrices actually mean? So we come back to this prisoner's dilemma, and you see these numbers. 3, 5, 1, 0. What do they actually mean to you? You can think for 10 seconds. Well, it has not been invented by biologists, it has been invented by economists. And economists, they knew what they were thinking about. So in economics, these numbers, they really represent material benefits. Typically it would be money, but you can think about food. And very importantly for an economist, the interaction partners, they are independent agents. You meet in a market, you do your exchange, you go your separate ways. These are the assumptions if you do look at the analysis from economists. And now you are evolutionary biologists, so you need to think a little bit further and say, like, well, we should be interested in fitness consequences. So it's not enough to talk about money or food, you need to think about what does this mean for the fitness, for the transfer of genes to the next generation, for the individuals that you're observing. And this is potentially complex. So you see again the material benefit prisoner's dilemma pair of matrix, where it's very clear if you take it seriously, if you play it once, you should defect because it's dominant over investing. But then we have concepts that tell us, don't trust these numbers. The most important one is, of course, from Hamilton, kin selection, that if you are related with your partner, that you share genes, and therefore you should incorporate also the indirect fitness effects. And then there's Gilbert Roberts, who pointed out that you might have actually interdependence between players if you are living in the same group. That's likely where you have cooperative interactions. Well, if you're in the same group, you are monkeys, you defend your territory against neighbors. Well, if you defend your territory against neighbors, you are interdependent. If we lose territory, we all suffer. Or think about males and females, you want to raise offspring together, you are interdependent. You need to raise them together, otherwise it doesn't work. So as soon as you have some high level of relatedness or interdependence, this needs to be incorporated for fitness consequences. And so, for example, here, to understand what 4.5, it's 3 for yourself, and half of the 3 for your partner, that's 1.5, that makes 4.5 and 4.5. And you do the same exercise for all these possible outcomes, and then you see the dynamic is reversed. You should defect on an investor, but you should cooperate with a defector. So now you have a different kind of game with what is called negative frequency dependent. The best thing what you can do depends on what the others are doing. And these are called snowdrift game or hawk-dove game or chicken game. So just by incorporating important biology, the fitness consequences have changed. So this is what we are kind of facing. And this is still a simple scenario. Let's go one step further and think about material benefits. What do they mean for your fitness? And it's clear when you are hungry and you eat something, the consequences are very important, because otherwise you are dying if you don't get food. But if you are satiated and you get some more, that's not a big effect on your fitness, because you are at the moment in a good shape. And so when you have two individuals interacting and one of them is hungry and one is satiated, the gains that you can have from defecting on a cooperator, the length of the green arrow and the orange arrow or yellow, they're the same. You shift the same amount to the right because you get the same amount of food from defection, but the consequences, they're very different. It's very important for the hungry individual. It's of minor importance for a satiated one. Now, if you don't consider kinship or interdependency, then it's still a prisoner's dilemma game, that you are better off on defecting your partner. But if you have already a mild interdependence or a mild relatedness, kind of a factor of 0.1, the satiated player kind of benefits from being cheated. Because your partner, if your partner is in a better state, it's good for you. Either because you share genes or because you defend the territory together or you raise chicks together. And that's really changing the logic of the game. So we should think about state. And just to give you one example that is very famous in biology, self-serving sentinels, like in meerkats. You have a group of meerkats, everybody's foraging, and there's this one individual that is just standing there looking out for predators. Predators like to be active early morning, and you see nobody doing sentinel activities because early morning all the meerkats are hungry. But as soon as one individual has been successful finding a lot of food, then it's willing to take this position, because if you are hungry, your little benefits of eating more, they're not as important as improving the survival of other group members. So state-dependent cooperation, we need to think about this. So why is this all important? Well, natural selection causes the mechanisms to evolve such that they prepare animals to behave appropriately according to their ecology, and therefore the corresponding fitness consequences. If you don't know your ecology and you bring your animals in the lab and you do some random experiments, you might find artifacts. And that's in ethology in principle known since more than 50 years. It's most easily demonstrated in human behavior. So if you play a prisoner's dilemma, one shot, one single interaction, anonymous, you explain this all to humans, it's very clear, any game theoretician can tell you, you must defect. It's the only proper solution. You do this with humans, we cooperate 50–60%. It's stupid, but the stupid thing is the design, because our psychology is not prepared for anonymous one-shot interactions. If you're interested in this, Stuart West has published quite a few papers on this and how humans do not behave optimally if you give them ecologically non-relevant cooperation tasks in the lab. So this was about payoffs. Now I need to talk about small worlds versus large worlds. And this is also how we should think about theory and what kind of theory we need to develop. So this is the standard game theoretic approach that you would find. There's a theoretician thinking very hard in the office, what is the social context? Do I want to make a model of reproduction, of conflict, of cooperation? Then you need to define the behavioral options, underlying strategies. There might be some, if you want to make a more complicated model, about state variables, about relationship between individuals. Are there bystanders that could observe? You define your payoffs, and then you find evolutionarily stable strategies. So if we apply this to the iterated prisoner's dilemma, this is very clearly a model on cooperation. You have cooperate or defect. You only have these two options. And then you think about strategies. Do you always cooperate, always defect? Then there are these tit-for-tat-like strategies. You have your payoff matrix, and then you see what is evolutionary stable, always defect, or some reciprocal strategies. This is the standard work of a theoretician, and this is what you can call a small world approach. You assume the animal knows everything, whether this is now cognitively, you would assume in humans it's cognitively. In animals they might have some genes that prepare them for the situation, but in principle the animal knows what it's supposed to do. And this approach has been successful for a long time in behavioral ecology, and there are many examples that seem to fit these small world assumptions. If you look at this drawing here, I think everybody understands what this male is up to. It's about mate choice, it wants to mate, there's a female it chooses, so the situation is clear. This is about nature. If you see this, I think it's also very clear. It might be the last thing you see, but this line is obviously not up to anything good. The question is now, well, how many examples of behavior out in nature fit this, that it's so clearly predictable? So what about this situation? You have a female baboon, has a dependent offspring, there's a root, and now there's this male approaching. What does the male want? Well, there's quite a lot of possibilities. The male may want to groom, it may want to be groomed, might want to copulate, might want to steal the root, might want to aggress the female, aggress the infant. Basically, if you're the female now, there's uncertainty in this situation. And as soon as there's uncertainty, then you need to what is called a large world approach, because now it depends really on the assessment and thinking about it, and there are a lot of factors that might now influence what the female is doing. Question is, how often do we need a large world? How often do we encounter uncertainty in our daily lives? I like to give you one example by introducing another of my favorite concepts out there in evolutionary biology, and this is called pseudo-reciprocity. Investing in byproduct benefits. It's Richard Connor who came up with this idea. And the idea is very simple. You see one person helping somebody else, giving resources away, and then the one that is helped uses these resources for yourself. But by doing something for yourself, you do something for the person that helped you. And that's why it is plus plus. My favorite way to introduce this is the supervision game. So typically students don't like the game too much. The supervisors there, we'll see whether Uri is embarrassed or not, but anyway. So we start out with the professor. The professor needs to think first. Do I help my PhD student or not? Helping is costly, so there's some investment. And then the PhD student has to decide, am I working or am I lazy? And obviously if you work, this is more effort than if you're lazy, even though you cannot get away with zero, but you need to think about this. And then you have the work quality. In the end, there's a thesis. And there's some numbers that define the work quality. And now you have to think like, well, should the professor help or not? Should the PhD student work or be lazy? Well, you make this the work quality minus the investment. You come up with these numbers. And now you try to understand what's the solution to this game. And the solution looks very nice, because the professor, independently of whether the PhD student is working or lazy, it's always better to help. You get 9 instead of 6 if the student works. You get 4 instead of 2 if the student is lazy. And when you take the PhD student payoffs, if you work 7 instead of 5, 2 instead of 1. So in principle, this is exactly pseudo-reciprocity. You invest in your PhD student to enable your PhD student to produce a work of better quality. The student should do it for him or herself. It's your career. So this is a perfect example of pseudo-reciprocity. But then, what do these numbers actually mean? 11, 6, 6, 2. We need to interpret this. What are the consequences? Well, I think 2 is a general problem. I guess the student will fail. That's obviously not good. Then you have something intermediate. Maybe no future in science, but at least you have... don't laugh at it. Right. So you have a brilliant future outside of science. So, okay. And then the 11, well, you can either suffer and show more as a postdoc, or you also have a brilliant future outside of science. And now the interesting thing is, of course, here in the middle. So there are 2 ways to get to 6. Either the professor invests, or the student works. So all of a sudden, first of all, we have to think about outside options. Yeah? So it's not just assuming that students stay in science. No, you stay in science or not, that has consequences. If you want to stay in science, yeah, you better work hard and stuff. But otherwise, yeah, what are you doing? And you have these potential conflicts now. We started with a simple game where there were no conflicts, but as soon as you have outside options, yeah, you get two different ways to do the work, so the student has a future outside science. And now you can think about more stuff. Typically, professors have more than one PhD student. You have a second PhD student. Let's assume the second PhD student is brilliant, so we have different work quality numbers. And we all know that the time of professors is limited, so what do you do now? Where do you invest? If you're a professor, do you invest more in the PhD 2 or in the PhD 1? I think the answer is relatively straightforward. But so we introduced partner choice in there because the time is limited. And partner choice, this is actually my PhD supervisor, Ronald Noel, who introduced biological markets to biology. We should think about choice options. And now we are here in this room. Now you as a student, you think like, yeah, should I go to this professor or to the other one? The professor thinking like, yeah, what does my PhD student want to have a future in science or not? And that means we are in a large world. We don't know the facts, and it develops also during the time. When I started my PhD, I was sure that I leave academia afterwards, and now I'm standing here. So there's uncertainty in there, and well, it's going from sexual selection concepts, the whole idea of partner choice. And then we come to this point, if you have one male and one female on an island, it's extremely boring. Their best option is to mate with each other. And if you have a population of males and females, everything can happen. That's why, yeah, living with a partner, choosing a partner is a really difficult business. And so, as soon as you are on this level, yeah, you're in a large world. And so, just to show you that we started with a model that seemed to be very easy, and now you add biology to it, and it's not easy anymore. Another example, and this is actually a good one, that's one of the examples you should really keep in your mind after this talk. So here, the baguette game at Munich train station. This is my aunt, Heike, with a soup. She bought a soup and there was no bread. The shop said, like, sorry, we are out of bread. So that's why she looks a little bit grumpy here. And she's on her way to the outskirts of Munich because that's where she lives and that's where I grew up. And then there's on the neighboring table, there's Philippe, there's a Frenchman, and the Frenchman has a baguette. And even though he's only drinking coffee, he could in principle give some baguette to my aunt. Now if you're a game theoretician, you're crying out, because he's on his way to Paris. He's a French guy. He was just, yeah. He lives in Munich, but going to Paris. Game theory analysis, very clear. There are two strangers. It's a one-shot interaction. Helping is altruistic. Don't do it. Keep your baguette for yourself. Very clear. Well, he shared his baguette anyway. He didn't understand about game theory. And now the question is, why can I tell you this story? Well, this is Heike and this is Philippe. And it shows you that we might define games, or a theoretician defines games, but when you live your life, you can change the game structure. And in this case, my aunt decided, no, if somebody is so nice to give me a bread in the train station, let's talk a little bit, let's exchange phone numbers and meet again. But you changed the game. This is very important. Games are not necessarily a given. And this is one of the very interesting papers in a philosophical transaction, McNamara and Leimer. Now we come back to, I give 20 euros away, but you can say like helping a stranger can be seen as an act of exploration in a large world where everything is uncertain. Maybe he's considering, now I should do my PhD in Switzerland, and maybe he's an outstanding student, I have no idea, and we find some ways. I didn't give him my house, I gave him 20 euros. We can, in Switzerland it's one pizza, so I think that's fine. So it's an exploration. You can see what happens. And don't forget, it's not just him that I gave the money. All of you saw that, oh, this guy is giving money away, so maybe I should go there. My challenge is, of course, to make sure that you are not coming now and try to exploit me. I want cooperation, not exploitation. There's somebody else in the room who actually contributed to this, but it's this concept of social competence, that you really try to understand, kind of based on social information, make decisions. So you get some social information about me now that I give the talk. So what do you do with this information? And with Roy, we thought about this a bit more. And what does it mean? Instead of having the standard game theoretic approach that we saw before, that you take the concept of social competence. So now they are the same ingredients, but the order changes. Now it's not a theoretician, but it's individuals that use internal and importantly external information to assess a situation. Then you make a behavioral decision. Do you help? Do you fight? Do you mate? And this defines the social context. Is it about conflict, reproduction, cooperation? And this gives payoffs. So this is back to the situation. This male might approach to groom the female. If the female thinks, oh, he wants to steal my root, this will be a conflict situation, no matter what the intention of the male was. But there's selection on the female to understand this, to use external internal information, assess the cues, assess state variables, relationship. Is this, how was it in the past? Am I observed by a dominant male or not? This all might influence her decision. And this is what this selection on social competence, to make the best out of the situation. That's what's the challenge in a social species, make the best out of each situation. If you're good at this, then you accumulate more resources and your survival and reproduction will be increased. So social competence is about large worlds rather than small worlds, and now it is a biological question: how many interactions are small world, how many are large world? And now we come to the last point, being explicit about mechanism. This is standard evolutionary game theory. You either assume there's a gene that codes directly for a strategy, or you, in the more complex one, you have genes interacting with the environment during ontogeny, and you get to conditional strategy, like if I'm in good state, I help. If I'm in bad state, I don't help. But what we really need is, of course, gene and environment interact to develop a brain. But then the brain learns and remembers, and this is how you get to your decision rules. And so if you think about mechanisms, then of course natural selection should adjust the cognitive toolkit and the neurophysiology to the ecological demands. So it's an adaptation. At the same time, if you know about mechanisms, they impose constraints. I mean, we cannot know everything, and we need to build our decisions on what's available. And now I talk you a bit through our system. So these are the cleaner fish, Labroides diminutus, that I study since 25 years. And Lexa gluta was from the beginning a male collaborator. I take you to Lizard Island, you take a boat, you go either observing them in the reefs around the island, or you catch some fish and do lab work. So all my lab work is actually happening abroad. I don't have aquaria in Switzerland. And so I think here I have to click on the screen to give you an idea. So here you have your cleaner rest. They have a small cleaning station called territory, and there other reef fish, they come to get ectoparasites removed. And cleaner fish have about 2,000 interactions per day. You see the clients come, they pose, they invite for inspection. And what you can see here is that there are two fish simultaneously posing. So cleaner fish have to decide which one gets priority, which one has to wait. And there's a lot of hectic. What makes the system really interesting is that cleaner fish should remove ectoparasites, but they don't like ectoparasites very much. They like the mucus, what makes the fish slimy. They like to dig into mucus, and that's a protective layer. That's cheating if they eat mucus, and so there's this conflict of interest that makes the whole thing interesting. And now you see sometimes when they dig into mucus, then yeah, they jolt and then they swim off. This would be a visitor. Large territory can go to another cleaner, swims off. This one is a resident, it lives with this one cleaner. If you live with the cleaner, you need to educate it so that the cleaner fish remembers the next time after being chased, after being punished. When the cleaner interacts with this fish again, it will give a good service. So it remembers past interaction. This is the behavior they're most famous for. They can enter the mouths of predators without being eaten, but I won't talk about this today at all. But I will focus on this different types of clients and partner choice. This is a picture from the Red Sea. You have a patch surrounded by sand. The cleaner fish lives on this patch. There's one cleaning station. And then you have some species that are also living on this patch. So we call them residents. They don't have choice. They need to live with this one cleaner. That's when you do punishment. And then there are other species. They cross the sandy areas. There are other patches with other cleaners. And so they visit the cleaner, and they have choice between cleaning stations. And one of the key differences between visitors and residents is that if you have now a resident and a visitor seeking service simultaneously, which happens quite often, if you have 2,000 interactions per day, there can be two clients, then the cleaner fish should give priority to the visitors. Because a visitor, if you make them wait, they swim off and go to a different cleaner, and then you have lost them. The resident must wait. So visitor, resident, priority to visitors. You observe in the field that cleaners are doing this, but then you think like, yeah, there are different species and visitors are typically larger. Let's do this with an experiment in the lab where you can control for certain factors. So there were two master students, two PhD students, two more senior scientists, Sarah Brosnan, famous primatologist from Atlanta, and we asked the question, yeah, can cleaners learn to prefer an ephemeral food source, a visitor, over a permanent one, and then generalize? So you have the two plates. Sorry, the next one I will need to be there. So you see one is pink, one is green. There's also the pattern orientation is different. There's the same amount of food, a little bit of prawn, but one plate, we leave it in, and it's willing to wait for inspection, whereas the visitor plate, if they're not serviced immediately, we take it away. I show you one successful trial and one unsuccessful trial. So green is good, goes to green, goes to pink, plates are out. Two items. Now it goes to the wrong plate first, to pink, and before it can go to the green plate, it's removed. One item. So by learning to prefer the ephemeral food plate, you double the amount of food intake. Very simple experiment in principle from the design, and then you count how many trials until individuals reach significant performance. We did this with adults and juveniles, and you see adults typically about 40, 50 trials. Importantly, all of them learned it. The juveniles, they did not learn it. So this one here is not a little Einstein. It had a preference for pink. And afterwards, we reversed the roles of the two plates. It had 200 trials to reverse its preference, and it didn't, so no understanding. So there seems to be some role of ontogeny in there. But the question is now, is this difficult? Or could any species with a large enough brain act like a cleaner fish and prefer ephemeral food plates over others? And so we tested the who is who in primatology, chimps, orangutan, capuchins, and you see generally they don't do it, not within 100 trials. You think like there are two honorary cleaners in there. These chimps, they all have names. They are famous chimps from Atlanta. But then you do the reversal and you see they didn't understand anything and they got completely frustrated and opted out. Sarah and me, we had kids at the right age, so we did it with M&Ms at home. And then more systematically, kids need to be more than 4.5 years of age to solve this. When they already have theory of mind, it's easier to pass the Sally N test than to pass this test. Rats and pigeons, they're abysmal. They did with a Skinner box 2,000 trials and they don't learn it. The only species that learn it is African grey parrots, and they're honorable cleaners, but we are not entirely sure whether there's clever hunt syndrome or so. There's some papers if you're interested in this. So there's something that's really difficult about this task. And if you try to understand what makes this task difficult, you need to go more into animal cognition. And I just give you the definition as I use it from Sarah Shuttleworth. Cognition, broadly defined, includes all ways in which animals take in information through the senses, process, retain, and decide to act on it, which means from perception to decision making. It's not just theory of mind or imitation learning or so. No, perception is an important part of it. And I show you why perception, you really need to consider perception if you look at performance. So here, in our experiment, the information was in the color of the plate. And here you have just the cleaner adults and the capuchins. And then with Laurent Breton, we thought like, yeah, maybe this is ecologically not relevant because monkeys don't get food on plates. So maybe they ignore the information that's on their retina, because what makes your brain really amazing is not so much what it can do, but also what it filters out. Your brain is constantly filtering information and tells you, yeah, ignore, ignore, ignore. And so we thought, okay, let's do it differently. Let's put the information in the food color. So now we have two gray plates, and one food item is pink and the other one is green. And what happens then is actually that both the cleaners and the monkeys now they can solve the task just by putting the information elsewhere. Even though I don't want to go into details, I also think it makes the task easier. But still, perception and salience is very important for performance. Second, perception. We have quite a lot of variation in cleaner fish and fish densities around Lizard Island, and we started at some point to go to a nice continuous reef and more like patches, so different clean and klein densities. And then we had what you call natural experiments. We had cyclones in the northern part in 2014-15. We had coral bleaching, very strong coral bleaching because of El Niño in 2016, which changed again fish densities. And Zegni Tricky, during her PhD, she actually did this biological market experiment. Every single year she went to Lizard Island, so she did it 4 times. We did it several times before. And so we could at some point see under which circumstances are cleaner fish actually really good in solving this biological market task. And it turns out that the conditions are actually quite restrictive. You need a proper density of cleaners, and you need clients that are really swimming off if they are made to wait. And if this is not the case, then their performance in the task is actually not good. They have problems performing well. And then you ask the question, well, what does this mean? Does this mean that all these cleaners cannot distinguish between residents and visitors? I told you before that visitors are typically larger than residents. And so Sharon Wisman, she did this experiment where you have a visitor and a resident as before, but now we give them in different size classes. And you see they can overlap in size. And you just make all the combinations between all the plates. And if you do this, then you have the visitor larger than the resident in 76, same size 12%, visitor smaller than resident 12%. And that means if you don't pay attention to color, but only to size, with a perfect size-based rule, you can still get it right in 80% of the cases. So you could solve the task causally with color and get 100% right, ideally, or you solve it with size and you get 82%. And we did this now with high density and low density cleaners. The first thing that you see is that every single cleaner solved the task, all of them. But how did they solve it? So this is now after they reach the learning criterion. You have in black from the complex habitat performance, correct? Visitor larger than resident, visitor same size, visitor smaller than resident. And you see for the complex habitat, they always perform well. They really learn to pay attention to color. Whereas from the simple habitat, they are only above chance because they follow the size-based rule that when the visitor is larger than the resident, yeah, that's when they can do it. And that means that cleaners from the complex habitat, they mostly focus on color, which is species identity. And the cleaners from the simple habitat, they mostly focus on size, which is the food patch quality. So this is again a perception difference. What do you pay attention to that leads to the difference in performance? So we made a model out of this. I'm running over time, no?
No.
No? Okay. So 2 postdocs, Joseph and Andres, and 2 senior scientists, because I'm not a modeler, but these people know more about modeling. And we wanted to understand with modeling the cognitive baseline. And you really want to understand this sequence in time. There can be visitor-resident, there can be nothing, only a visitor, only a resident, 2 visitors, and out of this sequence now, give priority to visitor over resident. And I just give you the key results of these models. So the first thing is, if you take basic associative learning, reinforcement learning or operant conditioning, and it's 2 over 1 item in the end. You learn this with reinforcement learning without any problems in a simultaneous 2-choice task, but you don't learn it when you present it like the biological marker task. So basically, if you present it like this, there's no problem with reinforcement learning. But if you introduce the sequence 1 plus 1, you cannot do it with reinforcement learning, because your first choice, you get exactly the same reward. And only afterwards, you get a second item. So, to be able to solve this, subject must apply configurational learning. Chunking is another term for it, to give a client different values depending on the specific situation. So a cleaner fish must learn that a visitor has a different value when it's paired with a resident than if it's with another visitor or if it's a visitor alone. Different values, different situations. Otherwise, it's not possible. Oops. And that's still not enough, but you also need to be able to incorporate future consequences of current choices. So that if I go to the resident, there's nothing. If I go to the visitor, there's still a resident. So this is the chain of events in there. And then you can think about 2 ways of being able to solve this. You can either chain the sequence, which is supposedly more complex, or you can feel a negative reinforcement when the visitor swims away, that you feel really bad about this. And that's why the next time you go to the visitor, that you feel the leaving is a form of psychological punishment. So to see whether it's chaining or negative reinforcement, we combined the model from Andres with the data from Zegni and tried to model under which circumstances do we get the right answers. And then you get, this is chaining and negative reinforcement, this is just chaining, and this is negative reinforcement. A lot of information, so I just show you the key results here. So if you have negative reinforcement only as the mechanism, you do stupid things. Basically, the heat map is opposite corner than this one. You pay attention, you give priority to visitors when you are rare, when the market favors you. There are many clients for you, you have the choice, but this is the situation where clients, more often because there are so many clients, there will also more events where they swim off. And that's how you learn to give priority to a visitor, even though it doesn't matter, because there are so many fish coming in that you shouldn't care about it. So negative reinforcement prevents actually adaptive responses to market condition, because when you need it, you don't really show it. Whereas here, if you have only chaining, now you see it's really fitting the same as here. This is what you should do. And so, given that we have now the correspondence between the data and chaining, it means that cleaners have some understanding of future consequences of current actions. So if I summarize these models, and behind them, of course, the data, the task is really not trivial in the sense that simple positive reinforcement learning is not sufficient. They need to distinguish between different constellations, which is configurational learning or chunking, and they need to incorporate future consequences so that they do adaptive decision making fitting the market conditions. And so fish densities in this case, they now explain the variation in performance that we see in the lab. And this is another conclusion. When I think about 25 years ago when I started, I had no idea that I would get to fish cognition, because I'm a trained evolutionary biologist. So they're definitely smarter than I thought. And if I want to wrap up now the entire talk, the conclusions about social behavior in general, then very important take-home message: helping is not an evolutionary puzzle anymore, but you need to understand the species ecology to understand how material payoffs translate into fitness consequences, because that's what natural selection cares about. Consider interdependence and partner choice. These are really important forces. So any model, any understanding of your system, think about it. Consider whether your question actually can be solved with the narrow small world approach. There are cases where this is possible, but be aware that many problems need a large world approach, which makes your life much more complicated, but also more interesting. Selection on social competence is actually what allows individuals to choose the best game. So this is basically, you should check more like how individuals maneuver their social environment and try to get to the best situations. And yeah, we definitely need to become more explicit about the evolution of mechanisms. So you see there's a kind of rainbow answer to this. It makes your life more complicated as a scientist, but again, I insist on it also makes it much more interesting if you embrace the complexity of your research. And with this I'm done, and I would like at the end to acknowledge Johanna Hona, who has made all these drawings there. And if you're interested, if you ever need a drawing for your own publications, you can contact her. And so I'm ready to take questions.